You wake up to the sound of bells. Not your phone alarm. Not a cheery jingle from a smart fridge reminding you it's oat milk o'clock. No. You wake up to the death bells. A slow, heavy, metallic reminder that someone has died. Again. And no, this isn't a dream. You're in medieval Europe. The year is irrelevant, honestly. Just know it smells like old meat, wet hay, and the inside of a leather boot that's been worn too long. You're welcome. Your mattress is a lumpy pile of straw that's basically 10% bugs and 90% regret. Your pillow is a cloth sack filled with disappointment. There's no duvet, just a coarse wool blanket that makes you itchy in ways science still can't explain. You rub your eyes and breathe in deeply. Bad choice. The air is thick with wood smoke, boiled cabbage, and the faint scent of livestock doing unspeakable things outside. Someone important has died. You don't know who yet, but the whole village is buzzing. Not literally, though that might be lice. Probably lice. You drag yourself out of bed, though bed is a generous word for this splinter pile, and step onto the cold, stone floor. Socks? No. Slippers? Try 2 wooden planks tied together with twine. You're now what people in the 21st century might call grounded in gratitude. You're also grounded in cold mud. As you shuffle outside into the morning fog, which looks exactly like sadness wearing a blanket, you're greeted by your neighbor. He nods solemnly and says, "Another one." You don't ask who. You just nod back. Because in the Middle Ages, asking too many questions gets you burned, accused of sorcery, or both. And let's face it, you already give off witchy vibes. So before you fully settle into this medieval malaise, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what's happening here. If passive-aggressive, historically accurate bedtime stories are your thing, congratulations, you've found your people. Drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I love seeing who's out there listening to centuries-old suffering as their bedtime lullaby. Now, back to morning. The death bells keep ringing. It's a low, dragging sound. Fun fact, the number of bell tolls often match the age of the deceased. So if the bells just went off 32 times, congratulations, you're going to be here for a while. And if you're wondering how they kept count, they didn't always. Sometimes they just guessed and hoped no one noticed. Because when your life expectancy is roughly the same as a moderately healthy houseplant, nobody's really doing background checks. Death is everywhere. It's woven into the rhythm of life like fleas into your underpants. Medieval Europe didn't just mourn the dead. It danced with death. It painted it on church walls. It wrote songs about it, usually in Latin and usually with way too many verses. And the mourning rituals? Oh, they were elaborate, dramatic, emotionally intense. Honestly, more committed than most modern relationships. So let's talk about what happens when someone kicks the medieval bucket. It usually starts with the smell. If you're rich, your body gets sprinkled with herbs, wrapped in cloth, and sometimes even salted like a festive ham. If you're poor, which you are, let's be honest, your body goes from warm to worm food in record time. The village women, often called death washers or sin scrubbers, unofficial title, come in to clean your corpse. They wash it with water that is never warm, and they do it by candlelight while muttering prayers and side-eyeing your various sins. This is not a glamorous job. It pays in cabbage, gossip, and the occasional wooden spoon. But it's sacred work. Because medieval people took the whole clean body, clean soul thing seriously. Dirt on your feet? Understandable. Dirt on your soul? That's eternal damnation material, my friend. After the body is washed, and by washed we mean lightly smeared and rolled around until the worst of the filth is removed, it's dressed. Usually in a shroud if you're poor, or actual clothes if you're wealthy. Occasionally people were buried naked, because clothes were expensive and someone alive could really use that tunic. Sentiment was lovely, but will cost money. Now comes the wake. And no, this isn't like modern wakes where you awkwardly hold a drink and whisper things like, "She looked peaceful." No, this is a loud, chaotic, sometimes drunken affair where people cry, sing, argue, and occasionally pass out. Imagine a Renaissance fair with more grief and less turkey legs. If you're Irish or Scottish, the wake might include keening, a form of mourning where women wail loudly, rhythmically, and sometimes poetically about the deceased. It's beautiful, haunting, and frankly, terrifying at 2 a.m. Keeners were often hired professionals. Yes, professional mourners. That was a real job. You weep, scream, and lament so convincingly that even the rats get emotional. Not a bad gig if you've got a flair for drama and lungs like bagpipes. While the body lies in state, sometimes on a wooden table, sometimes on a stone slab, never on anything remotely comfortable, candles are lit to guide the soul. The smell of tallow mingles with rosemary, sweat, and the damp odor of medieval people who have not bathed since the last comet sighting. And then comes the funeral. If you're wealthy, this involves a priest, Latin chanting, incense, and at least one person pretending they liked you more than they actually did. If you're poor, it's a brief ceremony, a few muttered prayers, and a wooden box that looks suspiciously like someone's repurposed furniture. Cemeteries were often around the church, because who doesn't want to spend eternity listening to Father Bernard yell about original sin? Graves are dug by hand, usually by people who are neither enthusiastic nor sober. The body is lowered, the earth is filled in, and life goes on. Until it doesn't. But we're not done yet, because medieval mourning didn't end at the grave. Oh no, that would be far too efficient. You're now expected to mourn. Publicly. Performatively. At a level that would make TikTok influencers take notes. If you're a widow, you wear black. Or sackcloth. Or sometimes just sit on the ground and look despondent for weeks. Mourning periods could last months or even years. Which sounds sad until you remember it also meant you got out of chores and socializing. Sorry, can't help with the hay harvest. Still grieving. Wealthy families held anniversary masses for the dead, 1 year after the death, and sometimes every year after that. It was like a birthday party, but with less cake and more weeping. Poor families? They just lit a candle and hoped nobody else died in the meantime. Spoiler, someone always did. And let's not forget morning food. Yes, you heard that right. In some regions, especially in England and parts of France, people would hand out special funeral bread or soul cakes. These were dense, bland pastries meant to be eaten while praying for the deceased. Soul cakes, because nothing says eternal salvation like dry carbs. Now, if you're a monk or nun, congratulations, you're in mourning all the time. The monastic life was essentially one long funeral with occasional breaks for cheese. When one of your fellow cloister companions dies, the rest of the abbey goes into full ritual mode. Chanting, psalms, endless kneeling, and of course, lots and lots of manuscript entries. Because nothing is truly final until someone writes it down in an impossibly tiny script no one will read again for 800 years. There were even special days for mourning everyone in general. All Souls Day, for example. A holiday where you literally mourn all the dead. Yes, all of them. Even the ones you didn't like. Especially the ones you didn't like. Because spite transcends mortality. And if you really wanted to go the extra mile, you could donate money to have perpetual masses said for your soul. That means monks would chant prayers for you every day until the end of time. Or until the monastery ran out of wine. Whichever came first. Still awake. Good. Because we're just getting into the weird part. Sometimes, mourning got theatrical. In 14th century France, for instance, noble families commissioned effigies, wax or wooden likenesses of the deceased. These were carried in elaborate funeral processions, dressed in real clothes, and sometimes even had tiny crowns placed on their heads. So, a medieval Build-A-Bear, but for grieving aristocrats. In England, the death of a king meant national mourning. The bells rang across the land, nobles wore black, and for a brief moment, everyone pretended they were sad, even if they'd been quietly hoping the guy would drop dead for years. Politics in the Middle Ages was less Game of Thrones and more game of who's crying loudest at the funeral. And then there were relics. Occasionally, a body was considered too holy to bury whole. So, they chopped it up. Lovingly. Respectfully. Maybe a finger for one church, a toe for another, the skull for a lucky cathedral in France. Suddenly you've got body parts doing a European tour, while your ghost watches on in confused horror. Mourning wasn't just for people. It was for symbols. You could mourn a relic lost in a fire. A holy book dropped in a flood. A saint's shrine desecrated by invading armies. You might even mourn a king's horse. Not kidding. Royal horses got better funerals than 98% of the peasant class. Probably better oats, too. So yes, death in the Middle Ages was dramatic, ritualistic, and deeply theatrical. It was also communal. You didn't mourn alone. You wailed in groups. You wept with strangers. You shared soul cakes, lit candles, and whispered prayers to saints who were probably too busy judging 12th century plumbing accidents to listen. And yet, beneath all the rituals and incense and handmade wax dolls, there was something oddly comforting. A sense that death wasn't the end, just a smelly, expensive intermission. So as you lie back, hopefully with cleaner sheets than our medieval friends, imagine the soft glow of candlelight, the distant hum of a Gregorian chant, the rustle of shrouds and the gentle clang of bells in the mist. You're not alone. You're surrounded by ghosts, very polite ones, who just want you to sleep through the rest of their funeral. Close your eyes. Or don't. We're not done yet. You wake up again. Or maybe you never fell asleep. Time has lost all meaning. You're in a small English village now. It's raining, obviously, because this is medieval England and the weather has only two settings, cold drizzle and plague. Today, however, isn't about weather. It's about logistics. You've already learned how people mourn the dead. But now, we're getting into the real meat of the matter, what actually happened when someone died. Spoiler, it involved more paperwork than you'd expect for a society that still thought bathing caused disease. Let's begin with the basics. Someone dies. Maybe peacefully in their sleep, maybe dramatically in a cart accident involving one pig, 2 barrels of mead, and poor life choices. Either way, the moment the person stops breathing, the medieval funeral machine kicks into motion. And yes, it is a machine. An oiled, wheezing, passive-aggressive machine run by clergy, gravediggers, relatives with inheritance ambitions, and the occasional wandering minstrel looking for free stew. First, someone has to declare the person dead. Not officially. There's no coroner, no beeping monitor, no clipboard, just a local with enough experience to say, yep, he's gone. Sometimes that's a priest. Sometimes it's a midwife who doubles as a death watcher. Sometimes it's just the village gossip who was conveniently nearby with suspiciously accurate timing. Next, the body must be prepared. If you're rich, a team is summoned. They arrive with towels, candles, scented herbs, and a sort of grim enthusiasm you only find in people who've seen a lot. The body is washed, as before, but now dressed in burial clothes, often a long white shroud tied to the hands and feet. It's almost like wrapping a burrito, but instead of rice and beans, it's just a recently deceased Uncle Richard and some rosemary. If you're poor, which, again, statistically, you are, the washing might be done by neighbors, or your spouse, or whoever is willing to get close enough, without gagging. There's no formal training, just a mixture of tradition, whispered prayers, and pure guesswork. While the body is being washed, the news spreads. And by news, I mean word of mouth, shouting down alleyways, or in very fancy cases, a town crier who literally screams, "The blacksmith is dead," while wearing a hat shaped like disappointment. You get the picture. Enter the death guilds. Yes. In medieval Europe, there were guilds for everything. Bakers, masons, shoemakers, weavers, and yes, even the dead had their own community networks. If the deceased belonged to a guild, say, the Guild of Candlemakers, that guild was often obligated to attend the funeral. Sometimes, they even had rules. Bring a candle, wear a hood, say 3 Hail Marys, and try not to look bored during the sermon. Some towns had burial fraternities, organizations specifically designed to make sure no one got dumped in a ditch like a sack of old laundry. These groups provided coffins, pallbearers, and prayers. Basically, the medieval version of a funeral home, except everyone smelled like onions and the brochure was carved on wood. If the dead person had some money, they might have paid ahead for what's called soul guild. This wasn't a guild for souls, because that would be too fun. It was a group of people who would pray for your soul after you died, every day, sometimes for years. Think of it as spiritual insurance. Or divine bribery. Either way, it was wildly popular and vaguely unsettling. Meanwhile, the gravedigger is notified. Now, listen. Gravediggers in the Middle Ages were a special breed. They were often peasants with strong backs and weak social filters. Some did it for coin. Some for bread. Some just liked the quiet. Most had a complicated relationship with alcohol. Digging a grave by hand is no joke. It could take hours. And if the ground was frozen, it might take days. In colder months, people sometimes buried their dead above ground temporarily, waiting for the earth to soften. So yes, there were seasonal piles of bodies in certain villages. And yes, people got used to it. Gravediggers weren't always the most sober individuals on the job, either. In fact, there are records, honest-to-God written records, of gravediggers showing up late, drunk, or with someone else's shovel. Occasionally, someone would forget to finish the grave, leading to what one monk described as a partial burial and a wholly unseemly affair. That's monk speak for Gary fell in the hole during the psalm. Let's talk about coffins, or rather, the lack thereof. Wood was expensive. Coffins were not standard unless you were wealthy or planning ahead, like a morbid Boy Scout. Most people were buried in simple shrouds. If there was a coffin, it was often reused. Yes, reused. As in, carry the body to the grave, dump it in, and take the box home. It's like Tupperware for corpses. Some people tried to get fancy and build their own coffins ahead of time. But this was considered bad luck because, and I quote, "The devil builds quickly for those who plan slowly." Translation: if you prepare for death, death speeds up to meet you halfway. The superstition industry was booming. Then there's the funeral procession. Imagine a small parade of sad people, trudging through the mud, carrying candles and muttering prayers. Children often led the way, ringing small bells to frighten away spirits. Because nothing wards off the supernatural like an 8-year-old with a cowbell. If the family could afford it, there might be a pall, a fancy cloth draped over the coffin or the shrouded body. These palls were sometimes decorated with religious symbols, saints, or extremely judgmental angels. And yes, they were also reused. After all, you don't just make a new pall every week unless you're royalty or deeply insecure. Once the procession reached the church, assuming the weather didn't kill someone else along the way, the Mass would begin. This was the centerpiece of the funeral. Latin, incense, genuflecting, the whole medieval production. The priest, who likely hadn't slept or eaten anything without mold since Tuesday, would chant over the body, calling upon saints, angels, and occasionally archangels if the deceased was very rich or very problematic. This was also the time for last-minute bribery. Families often paid the priest extra to slip in a few bonus prayers. Think of it as a spiritual tip jar. Here's a silver groat. Maybe mention Great Aunt Edith to St. Peter, loudly. And then, the final procession, to the grave. The priest might sprinkle holy water. Someone might drop a flower, a ring, or a suspiciously heavy stone, because not all deaths were natural. Karen. The gravedigger, ideally now sober, finishes the burial. And the people go home. Except not straight home. There's a stop to be made first, the funeral meal. Yes, that's right. After the grave, we feast. Depending on your social class, the funeral meal could range from a simple bowl of lentils to a full-on meaty extravaganza. The idea was to feed the mourners, honor the dead, and show off your pantry stockpile all at once. Bread, ale, cheese, and meats were common. In wealthier homes, you might even get a roast or a pie with actual meat instead of, surprise mushrooms and shoe leather. Guests were expected to eat solemnly. That didn't always happen. There are documented cases of funeral brawls. Yes, fights. At funerals. Over inheritances, debts, or whether the deceased really deserved that many prayers. One particularly spicy 13th century brawl ended with a roast chicken being used as a bludgeoning weapon. That's not metaphor. That's history. And for those who couldn't attend the funeral, no problem. The family would deliver food to them. Funeral leftovers, basically. It's like Uber Eats, but colder and with more emotional baggage. In some places, it was customary to leave food out for the dead. Yes, for the dead. Plates of bread and ale placed near the grave, because you never know when Grandma might swing by for a snack. These soul offerings were meant to appease restless spirits. Or nosy neighbors. Possibly both. And now, finally, you return home. The funeral is done. The grave is closed. The priest is tipsy. The guests have wandered off, mumbling about candle costs and the suspicious shape of the coffin. You collapse onto your itchy straw bed and exhale. But wait, the morning has just begun. Because now comes the memorial season. There will be prayers, masses, lighted candles, maybe a carved wooden plaque if you're lucky. And if you're unlucky, another death next week. Rinse, repeat, mourn again. It was exhausting, solemn, and sometimes absurd. But in a strange way, it made death feel normal, shared, less terrifying. Because even if your body ends up in a reused coffin and your wake is crashed by an alcoholic gravedigger, at least you got somebody to show up, ring a bell, and complain about the soup. So rest your eyes, if you can. Think of flickering candles, the soft chant of monks, a plate of funeral bread on a cold stone table, and a world where mourning wasn't a checkbox, it was a community obligation, served with ale and existential dread. You wake up again. Not in a coffin, thankfully, although it's probably about as comfortable as one. You're on a straw mattress that smells like goat. Or maybe the goat is just there, staring at you. You're not sure. The fire is low, your joints are aching, and somewhere outside, an owl is screaming like it's been personally betrayed. Welcome back to Medieval Life. Today, we're dealing with a problem that has haunted humanity for centuries, literally. What happens when the dead won't stay dead? So before we dive into today's perfectly calm and not at all ghost-infested episode, go ahead and like the video, subscribe if you're into this kind of weirdly relaxing historical misery, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Because if you're lying awake in Kansas at 3 a.m. wondering how to keep medieval ghosts out of your pantry, you're not alone. You're just historically curious. Right. Back to the dead. We've already laid the body in the ground, sprinkled some holy water, sung some Latin, and fed everyone lentils and guilt. That should be enough. But here's the thing, medieval people did not trust corpses to stay where they were put. And honestly, with good reason. You see, when someone died in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just a biological event. It was a supernatural one, a spiritual one, a cosmic, bureaucratic nightmare. Death opened a door, and just like any door in medieval architecture, it didn't really shut all the way. There were drafts, spiritual ones. Let's start with the wake. You might think a wake is just sitting around a body, crying, drinking ale, maybe making a few tasteful jokes about how Uncle Walter finally lost the bet with the roof tiles. But in medieval Europe, the wake had a very specific purpose, to make sure the dead person stayed dead. Yes, they watched the body. 4 days. Usually 1, sometimes longer. This wasn't out of respect, okay, partly respect, but mostly out of fear that the soul hadn't properly left the body. That maybe the person wasn't all the way gone. That maybe, just maybe, you be pouring a mug of cider when the corpse sits up and ruins everyone's appetite. It happened. Rarely. But when your entire understanding of anatomy is blood, phlegm, and sin, you play it safe. During the wake, candles were lit, not for mood lighting, but to ward off demons. Mirrors were covered, because it was said that souls could get trapped in them. Cats were kept away from the corpse, because everyone knew that if a cat jumped over a dead body, the corpse would become a revenant. Yes, a revenant. A zombie. A vampire. A corpse with a grudge. Not even kidding. This was a widespread belief in many parts of Europe. There are texts, church decrees, and even graveyard excavations that show signs of anti-revenant burial techniques. You think we made this stuff up for scary movies? Oh no. This is the source material. Let's say you're in 13th century England. A villager dies. Everything seems normal. You bury him, you mourn, you go home. A few weeks later, people start whispering they've seen him. Near the edge of the woods. Eyes glowing. Mouth open. Smelling like regret and grave dirt. Livestock are nervous. Bread doesn't rise. One child swears the dead man asked for butter. What do? Well, if you're medieval, you dig him up. That's right. Exhumation. In some parts of Europe, especially in eastern regions like what is now Poland or Romania, it was common practice to dig up a suspected revenant. And then, let's just say things got weird. Sometimes they'd find the corpse bloated and rosy, a sign, they believed, that it had been feeding. On what, you ask? On the living. Not physically, but spiritually. It was thought that certain corpses could drain life force from the people they left behind, especially if there had been unfinished business. Like an unpaid debt, or a bad breakup, or using someone's ox without asking. So, after digging up the suspicious corpse, the villagers might drive a stake through its heart, or sometimes the stomach. They weren't picky. Cut off the head and place it between the legs. Stuff the mouth with stones or bricks to stop it from chewing. Rebury the body face down to confuse it. In extreme cases, burn the body, sprinkle the ashes in running water, and prayed to literally every saint on record. And just in case you're wondering, yes, archaeologists have actually found medieval graves with stones in mouths, decapitated skeletons, and even metal stakes in rib cages. So this wasn't folklore. This was funeral policy. Now, not everyone believed in actual zombies. Sometimes, they just thought the soul hadn't made it to heaven yet. These poor spirits were called restless dead. Think ghost interns. They'd wander around, moaning, maybe knocking over a candle or showing up in your dreams to ask for more prayers. Medieval people didn't find this weird. They found it routine. There were entire manuals for dealing with the restless dead. Priests were taught special prayers to release souls. Some communities had an official soul mass every year, where everyone got prayed for, just in case someone had been missed. Because the last thing you wanted was a dead uncle lurking in your barn whispering about unfinished taxes. If the spirit was especially cranky, they might hire a sin eater. That's right, a person who would literally eat a meal over the corpse, symbolically absorbing the dead person's sins so they could pass unclean. The sin eater got paid in food, usually bread and ale, and was universally hated because they were considered spiritually radioactive, like a human lint trap for evil. There are even stories of sin eaters getting haunted by the sins they absorbed. So that's fun. Now, what about haunted houses? Because yes, those existed. If a house was associated with multiple deaths, especially sudden, suspicious, or morally ambiguous ones, it might be considered cursed. People would avoid it. Rent would drop. Birds would refuse to nest on the roof. And yes, occasionally, someone would try to exorcise the entire house. Exorcisms weren't just for demon-possessed people. They could be done on houses, fields, even wells. If a spirit was suspected, a priest might walk through the house with incense and holy water, muttering prayers and very firmly not making eye contact with the shadows in the corner. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the haunting just got more creative. Let's pivot slightly to something you didn't ask for but are getting anyway: death omens. In the medieval mind, death never just happened. It was announced. If a dog howled at night, someone was going to die. If you dropped a candle and it went out, death. If the family rooster refused to crow, obviously death. If you had a dream of falling, of teeth falling out, or of a black-clad figure holding a lantern, congratulations, your cousin has 2 days left and you better start kneading that funeral bread. There were also tales of the wild hunt, a ghostly procession of the dead led by a spectral figure, sometimes a god, sometimes a demon, sometimes your grumpy great-uncle. If you saw the wild hunt in the sky, it meant a plague, war, or mass death was coming. Sleep tight. Let's talk about churchyards. You probably think of them as peaceful, quiet places with birds chirping and moss-covered stones. And sure, sometimes. But in the Middle Ages, they were loud. Not literally, but in terms of activity. People hung out in churchyards. They were social hubs. Kids played there. Merchants set up stalls during festivals. Dogs ran around. Sometimes people even dug up old graves to reuse the land because space was limited and decomposition waits for no one. And when someone saw a ghost in the churchyard, as happened a lot, people took it very seriously. The priest might come out and scold the ghost, or offer it absolution, or perform a midnight ritual with incense, and that look of him wondering why he didn't just become a blacksmith like his father wanted. We haven't even touched on hellmouths, but you know what? Let's do it. Hellmouths were often depicted in medieval art as literal gaping jaws in the earth, full of demons pulling people down by the ankles. People believed these could exist in real locations, bogs, caves, sinkholes, that one weird part of the forest where the air smells like soup. You did not want to be buried near a hellmouth. That was a direct ticket to eternal barbecue. So, to wrap up our ghostly interlude, mourning in the Middle Ages didn't end at the grave. It continued into dreams, rituals, warnings, and the occasional uninvited haunting. People believed the dead lingered, that they needed help to move on, that if you didn't pray, or sing, or light candles, or stuff their mouth with bricks, they'd come back. Not out of malice, usually, but because the medieval afterlife was a bureaucratic mess, and sometimes souls just got lost on the paperwork. So, as you drift into sleep tonight, imagine the gentle flicker of candlelight, the soft sound of bells, the rustle of linen over still limbs, and just the faintest whisper at the edge of hearing, asking politely for one more prayer before sunrise. You wake up again. Not in your bed. Not even on a mattress. You're floating, gently, confusedly, above your body. Yes, that's your nose down there. You're pale, and you still look annoyed, probably because you died in the middle of dinner and now someone else gets your bread. Your family is crying. The priest is mumbling. There's a smell of incense and boiled onions. Someone is already arguing over your boots. Congratulations. You're dead. But in the Middle Ages, death was not the end. Oh no. It was just step one in a long and complicated customer service experience called the afterlife. Buckle up. You're about to go on a journey with more bureaucracy than the Department of Motor Vehicles and fewer helpful signs. Now, before you try to float off toward the warm glowing light, hold on a second. While you're suspended between earthly concerns and eternal judgment, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this kind of delightful historical misery helps you sleep. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I love seeing how many of you are lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, contemplating medieval ghosts at 2:37 a.m. You're my kind of people. Okay, back to you. Dead. But not dead. Just between stages. So, you're a soul. A disembodied, floaty consciousness with no insurance coverage. You'd think this would be a relaxing moment. But you're medieval, so your brain has been thoroughly marinated in fear, sin, and the ever-present possibility that you didn't confess every single thing you were supposed to. Did you remember that time you stole an extra turnip? Or had an impure thought about Brother Matthew's beard? Or skipped Mass that one Thursday when your cow went into labor? You might be going to hell. But don't panic just yet. The medieval church had a three-tiered system, like a loyalty rewards program, but eternal and terrifying. Heaven, the VIP lounge, reserved for saints, the very pure, and people who miraculously avoided sin while living in a society that bathed twice a year and thought leeches cured headaches. Hell, the bad place. Population, plentiful. Heated floors, aggressive hospitality, lots of weeping. Purgatory, the spiritual DMV. This is where most souls went. You weren't good enough for heaven, but not evil enough for hell. So you got to wait, and wait, and wait. 4 centuries. In pain. With no coffee. Now, you, being a perfectly average medieval person who tried reasonably hard to avoid sin, you're probably headed to purgatory. Here's what that looks like, a non-specific burning. Not as bad as hell, but still deeply unpleasant. You're not being tortured maliciously, just cleansed. Think of it like a cosmic detox. A spa, but instead of mud baths, you get regret and holy fire. And instead of a time estimate, you get however long your family remembers to pray for you. That's the catch. Because here's the secret of purgatory. You don't get out on your own. Nope. You rely on the living. On prayers. On almsgiving. On hired monks reciting psalms at dawn while you float awkwardly in a dimension made entirely of guilt and ash. So what do? You wait. You hover. You linger near your family, hoping someone, anyone, remembered to pay for those 30 masses you asked for. Now let's look at what your living relatives are up to. They're consulting a local priest. Probably a little nervous. They've just buried you, and the last thing they want is a haunting. So they commission some suffrages, that's the fancy term for spiritual favors. Prayers, masses, maybe a donation to a monastery of there. Feeling generous. If they're rich, they might establish an anniversary mass, a special liturgy held every year on the date of your death, complete with bells, incense, and a slightly bored monk named Robert who keeps forgetting your name. If they're poor, well, sorry. You might be waiting a while. But here's a fun twist. In the 11th and 12th centuries, the church began formalizing purgatory doctrine. They created whole books describing what it looked like, in vivid detail. According to these texts, purgatory isn't just spiritual. It has geography. There are levels, zones, fire pits, freezing lakes. One guy describes a soul being attacked by flaming squirrels. Another describes a staircase guarded by demons with long fingernails and bad attitudes. You don't just float, you're processed. Some souls ride flaming horses. Others fall into rivers of pus. One medieval monk had a vision where he saw people being roasted on spits while angels debated their case like some kind of celestial court. And here's the kicker, all of this depends on how much sin you had left on your soul. The more sins, the worse the punishment. Did you confess before death? Great. Did you do penance? Even better. Did someone pay for indulgences on your behalf? Wait. Let's talk about that. Indulgences were a kind of spiritual coupon system. You commit a sin, you confess, and then you pay, either in time, penance, money, or prayers, to reduce your time in purgatory. You could also buy indulgences for other people, dead relatives, friends, your dog, if the priest was having a flexible day. This was very popular. Monasteries got rich. Priests got busy. Poor villagers scraped together coins not for bread, but for the faint hope that Grandma Gertrude could shave a few decades off her soul sentence in the fire pit of minor gluttony. Now, let's pivot to visions. Because the medieval church loved a good ghost story, especially if it came with moral implications. People claimed to see the dead all the time. In dreams. In fields. Sitting on fences. Sometimes they just popped in during dinner to ask for more masses. This wasn't scary, it was normal. Monks wrote entire chronicles about ghostly visitations. One monk in Yorkshire claimed that a dead brother came to him every night asking for prayers, and when he finally got enough, he ascended in a puff of sweet-smelling air. Another monk saw a soul rise out of a coffin with snakes wrapped around its limbs. You know, classic bedtime reading. Let's talk about the good stuff now. Heaven. If, and this is a very big if, you were virtuous, confessed, did penance, and probably died as a monk, you might get fast-tracked to the celestial realm. Heaven was described as a shining city, with towers, with gold, with choirs of angels who presumably knew more than 3 chords. But medieval heaven was also deeply hierarchical. Not everyone got the same experience. Saints sat closer to God. Martyrs had special thrones. Ordinary people, you, might be somewhere on the outer edges, just grateful to not be on fire anymore. It wasn't exactly harps and clouds. It was more like a medieval manor, but clean. Everyone wore white robes. There was no hunger, no pain, and, miraculously, no lice. But you didn't just walk in. St. Peter was there with his book. And if your name wasn't in it, guess what? Back to purgatory you go. Meanwhile, hell remained the default destination for the unrepentant. And hell was elaborate. Medieval people described it as a machine, with compartments, demons assigned to specific tortures, fire, ice, screaming. It was an entire economy of suffering. One common image, sinners being boiled in cauldrons. Another, people hanging upside down while birds peck their eyes out. There was a whole section for gluttons where the food screamed back. Medieval artists loved this stuff. Entire cathedral walls were covered in murals of sinners being dragged by the ankles into the flaming jaws of the hellmouth. Now, here's a comforting thought. Some theologians believe that time worked differently in the afterlife. 1 minute could feel like 1,000 years. Or vice versa. So really, you could be forgiven, punished, and redeemed within a dream. Maybe. Hopefully. But you wouldn't know until the end of time, when the last judgment came. Yes. Even if you died in 1124 and had been in purgatory for 300 years, your soul was still technically waiting for the final judgment day. Because that's when everyone gets their permanent assignment. The dead would rise from their graves, bodies restored, souls reunited, and stand in a massive celestial queue, while Christ judged each person. One by one. Forever. This, by the way, is where the term terrible day of the Lord comes from. It was less of a party and more of a cosmic audit. So, to recap your journey, you die, you float, you maybe haunt a cousin, you go to purgatory and hope someone's praying for you. You either get promoted to heaven or wait until the judgment. If you're unlucky or truly rotten, you go to hell, and it's worse than Monday meetings. And all of this was meant to keep the living in line. Because nothing motivates moral behavior like the image of your soul being slow roasted by minor demons while your neighbors forget your name. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine your soul peacefully suspended above your earthly remains, listening to the faint sound of Gregorian chanting, and hoping that your cousin remembered to light that candle. Because if not, you've got centuries of spiritual paperwork ahead. You wake up to the sound of bells. Not the good kind, not the jingly kind you hear at a Renaissance fair when someone in a tunic tries to flirt with you using a lute. No, these are death bells. They toll once, then again, and then again, slowly, ominously, like someone's ringing a particularly judgmental cowbell from the sky. You're not dead anymore, technically. You're dead adjacent, hovering above the scene. Because today's your big day, your medieval funeral. And trust me, it's gonna be dramatic. If you've just tuned in and somehow missed the whole being dead in the Middle Ages plotline, don't worry. You haven't missed much except the part where you died, your soul panicked, and you began a multi-century spiritual waiting room experience. This chapter, however, is all about what happens to your body after it stops doing useful things like blinking or paying taxes. Now, before we descend into the glorious chaos of dirt, incense, and badly stitched mourning robes, don't forget to like the video and subscribe if you're enjoying this slow, soothing historical spiral into the underworld of old Europe. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from and what ridiculous time is it for you? Midnight in New Zealand? 4 a.m. in Saskatchewan? I love hearing where you're falling asleep to the sound of medieval people crying. Now, the medieval funeral. Equal parts holy ritual and local performance art. It begins, of course, with the body. Yours, specifically. Dead, cooling, and already becoming someone else's problem. Your family needs to act fast, because you're about to start smelling like a cheese wheel that's been left in the sun too long. Remember, no refrigeration, no embalming, and no Febreze. Just gravity, linen, and hope. They start by washing you. Carefully. Respectfully. Probably in cold water because, again, no plumbing. A close relative, usually the women of the household, remove your clothes, sponge your lifeless limbs, and try not to gag. You're given clean linen, or the cleanest available, and then wrapped like a sad, slightly lumpy burrito. If you're wealthy, you might get a shroud made of fine wool or linen. If you're poor, it might just be the old tablecloth. Either way, you're going in the ground wrapped up and barefoot, like a medieval baby burrito heading into the eternal dirt nap. And then comes the vigil. This is when your body is laid out in the house, or, if you're important enough, in the local church, for people to come and look at you. It's like a low-budget wake, but with more incense and fewer sandwiches. Your family lights candles. They place a crucifix in your hands. Sometimes they even put coins over your eyes, even though everyone knew that wasn't technically Christian doctrine. Old habits die hard. People come to pray, or stare, or gossip about whether your nose always looked like that. Neighbors shuffle in, cross themselves, and mutter half-remembered prayers. Children peek under the shroud. Aunt Mildred cries dramatically, even though you always suspected she secretly hated you. Then, the procession. Now, here's the thing, medieval people loved a good walk. Not for fun, of course. There was no such thing as recreational cardio. But a funeral procession was a chance to show status, sorrow, and how many people you could convince to pretend to like you. Your body is placed in a wooden coffin, unless you're too poor for one, in which case it's just a stretcher with attitude, and carried through the village. And this is where it gets theatrical. Imagine it, a small group of mourners trudging down a muddy road. The priest leads the way, swinging a Thursdayable full of choking incense. Altar boys trail behind, muttering Latin like they've got a mouthful of marbles. The family walks behind the coffin, trying to cry in a way that looks natural but not too moist. People watch from windows. Some join in. Others whisper. There's always that one guy who asks if the dead person owed him money. When you reach the church, assuming you get one, the priest performs a funeral mass. This is basically your final review, your heavenly Yelp rating. Your soul is somewhere nearby, listening as people pray for your forgiveness and hoping nobody mentions that one incident with the borrowed goat. The priest sprinkles holy water. He chants. He talks about resurrection. He does not mention the rats nibbling on bodies in the crypt below. Everyone knows. Nobody says it. Then comes the final act, the burial. In the early medieval period, people were often buried in churchyards, arranged around the building like morbid garden gnomes. The closer you were to the altar, the better your chances of hearing the final trumpet when Judgment Day arrived. Being buried near a saint or a holy relic. That was the medieval equivalent of VIP seating. But land was limited, so graves were reused. Often, you might be buried in the same spot as your grandfather or 4 other people, stacked like medieval lasagna. By the 13th century, if you were lucky or wealthy, you might be buried inside the church. under the floor, under the pews, right where people walked and knelt and occasionally tripped over your tombstone. If you were really wealthy, you got a tomb effigy, a stone sculpture of you lying in peaceful eternal slumber, looking about 30% more attractive than you ever did in life. These statues usually depicted the dead in serene prayer, wearing armor or gowns, often with lions or dogs at their feet, symbolizing courage, loyalty, or this person owned at least one decent pet. And if you were a noblewoman, you might even be buried with your wedding ring, a prayer book, or, I kid you not, a tiny carved chicken. Yes, archaeologists have found people buried with birds. Sometimes symbolic, sometimes weird, always deeply medieval. Meanwhile, the mourners return home. In some regions, it was customary to hold a funeral feast. The logic was simple: death was hungry work. You just walked 5 miles behind a coffin, cried in public, and accidentally inhaled half a stick of incense. You deserved a drink. So they ate. They drank. They told stories about the deceased, half of which were probably exaggerated for dramatic effect. Someone recited a psalm. Someone else tried not to spill gravy on their only tunic. And someone definitely brought up politics and ruined everything. But the mourning didn't end there. For widows, especially, the performance of grief was long, public, and expected. You might wear mourning clothes, usually plain, dark, and scratchy, for months or even years. No makeup, no dancing, no remarriage, at least not until society decided you'd wept enough to be trusted again. Wealthy widows sometimes commissioned chantry chapels, little personal church nooks where priests would say prayers for the soul of their dearly departed husband in exchange for land, money, or several pigs. These chapels were meant to keep the deceased soul fresh in God's mind, like a divine subscription renewal. Meanwhile, the rest of the village moved on. Life continued. Fields needed plowing. Bread needed baking. Children needed shouting at. And your memory slowly faded, unless you were a saint, a scandal, or a really good storyteller. Which brings us to the strange beauty of death anniversaries. Every year, on the date of your death, your family might hold a memorial mass. They'd light candles, say prayers, occasionally feed the poor in your name. This wasn't just religious. It was reputation maintenance. The medieval version of don't forget to like, comment, and share. And then, one year, the candles didn't get lit. Someone forgot, or died, or the family moved away. And that's when your name faded, slowly, like mist off a mourning field. But don't feel bad, because in the Middle Ages, being forgotten wasn't an insult. It was expected. Life was hard. Memory was short. And the church had enough rituals to make up for most of it. So as you lie there, imaginary, timeless, wrapped in a shroud that smells faintly of mold and old rosemary, know this: your death, like your life, was part of something bigger. A culture. A community. A very complicated theological system involving fire, angels, and monks who never learned to enunciate. You're gone. But for a little while longer, people remember. And that's the most medieval thing of all. You wake up in a house that smells like regret, onions, and someone's failed attempt at incense. But something is different this time. There's no priest mumbling Latin outside your door. No wailing neighbor. No death bell. In fact, the street is disturbingly quiet, like everyone decided to spontaneously give up being alive and social. Which, as it turns out, isn't far from the truth. You shuffle toward the door, slowly, because your dream self is still carrying the spiritual weight of a medieval casserole dish full of unresolved guilt, and when you open it, the world smells wrong. Sweet. Metallic. Like rotten apples were boiled in vinegar and then poured over something much, much worse. Congratulations. It's 1348. And the Black Death has arrived. You know, the plague? The thing with the buboes, the boils, the bleeding, the panic, and the deeply suspicious herbal poultices applied by a man in a beaked mask who looks like a nightmarish bird from a failed children's puppet show? Yes. That one. Let's set the scene. It's the mid-14th century. Europe is not exactly a sanitary utopia. The streets are paved with straw, dung, and dreams. People are still sleeping two to a bed. Baths are rare. Personal space is a myth. And cities are bustling little microbial amusement parks. So when Yersinia pestis hitches a ride on some fleas, who hitch a ride on some rats, who hitch a ride on a Genoese trade ship sailing from the Crimea, well, it's basically over before it begins. The plague hits fast. Like Taylor Swift ticket sale fast. Within months, entire towns are infected. Within a year, 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population is gone. Gone. Dead. Just poof. And if you're lucky enough to survive, you still get to live through the worst housing crisis, food shortages, and trauma spiral this side of the apocalypse. Hooray! Now, the thing about death in the Middle Ages is that people were used to it. Death was a roommate, a constant shadow, a guy who always showed up uninvited and ate your best cheese. But even medieval folks, with all their saints and skulls and doom paintings, weren't ready for this. The Black Death breaks the system. The rituals? Collapsed. The church bells? Overwhelmed. The funeral masses? Skipped. The priests? Dying too fast to perform last rites. Even the grave diggers can't keep up. People start digging their own graves just in case, like it's DIY home and garden, but with more pestilence and fewer succulents. Normally, we'd stop here and talk about how monks sang psalms, how funerals were beautifully tragic, and how people mourned in embroidered hoods. But this time, we're going off script. Because the Black Death changes everything about death, mourning, and how people emotionally process entire cities of corpses. Let's talk logistics. There are too many dead people. Like, way too many. You can't bury them fast enough. You can't pray over them fast enough. The traditional system collapses under the weight of all that mortality. In many towns, the graveyards literally fill up. The church, bless them, tries to hold the line. They expand cemeteries. They consecrate mass burial sites. In Avignon, they go full horror show and create a giant trench for plague victims, thousands of bodies layered like a deeply tragic medieval lasagna. And it's not just one city. This is happening everywhere. Florence, Paris, London, villages, monasteries, towns that no longer exist. The plague leaves behind so many bodies. People start burying them in their homes, in abandoned churches, and occasionally, just leaving them where they fell. In some towns, there are reports of plague carts, wooden wagons trundling through the streets, collecting the dead like an apocalyptic ice cream truck. Bring out your dead isn't just a Monty Python joke. It's actual history, shouted by actual people with actual existential dread. No funeral. No candles. No Latin chants. Just the sound of coughing, bells, and the soft thud of another body on a pile. Let's pause for a moment. Can you imagine what it would smell like? A summer in Florence. The sun is high. The bodies are stacked. The breeze carries notes of decomposition, spilled chamber pots, and the faint desperation of someone waving a rosemary branch at the air like it'll fix anything. You don't mourn so much as survive. People stop making eye contact. They stop visiting neighbors. They stop touching their children. They pray, of course, always praying, but the prayers become strange. Bargaining. Wailing. Threats. People confess every sin they can remember, including ones they definitely didn't commit, just to cover their bases. And still the plague comes. The church tries to explain it. Some say it's a punishment for sin. Others blame the Jews. Others say it's the air, miasma, poisoned by bad stars, or corruption, or demonic flatulence. So people burn incense, hang herbs from their doorways, smear strange ointments on their skin. Some join the flagellants, a fun group of shirtless, self-whipping penitents who believe that if you beat yourself hard enough, maybe God will stop beating everyone else. Spoiler, he doesn't. Meanwhile, funerary customs evolve in real time. No more individual graves. No more tomb effigies. Just pits, trenches, and the fast, anonymous piling of the dead. Some bodies go unburied for days. Some are buried with strangers. Some are tossed into rivers, caves, or anywhere that vaguely resembles a way. There's a psychological shift, too. In normal times, death was personal, specific, a ceremony, a closure, a community thing. But during the Black Death, death becomes background noise, a smell, a rhythm, a statistic before statistics were even invented. So what replaces mourning? Art. This is when Europe starts painting dancing skeletons, grim reapers, and grinning skulls. The danse macabre, or dance of death, becomes a theme across murals, manuscripts, and stained glass. It shows kings, popes, peasants, and nobles all dancing with corpses, because death doesn't care about your net worth or your property holdings. We also start to see memento mori art, skulls on rings, hourglasses, decaying faces carved into tombs, all there to remind you that you, too, will die. Charming. This is also the era where people write about visions of death and near-death experiences. You've got monks seeing skeletons in their soup, nuns recording dreams of burning corpses, priests detailing apocalyptic signs like talking goats and blood rain. It's not subtle, but it is cathartic. In a world where traditional mourning rituals no longer function, people turn to storytelling. Chroniclers describe cities filled with moans, children orphaned, dogs chewing corpses in the street, entire monasteries abandoned, with only silence and rotting vestments left behind. And yet, somehow, people still try to hold on to some version of dignity. In some places, communities set aside plague pits with temporary altars. People toss in a crucifix. Someone tries to say a mass over the trench. In London, the cemetery at East Smithfield is created specifically for plague victims, a structured, layered burial site that archaeologists are still studying today. In Avignon, the Pope, yes, the Pope, blesses all the Rhone River. Why? Because there were so many bodies being tossed into it that he wanted to make sure even the fish were consecrated by proxy. Honestly, 10 points for effort. Over time, as the plague burns out, slowly, viciously, and with horrifying echoes, communities rebuild. Mourning returns. Funerals resume. But everything's different. There's a new awareness of mortality. A new obsession with time. With preparation. With legacy. You see the rise of wills, deathbed bequests, endowment of churches. People donate land to monasteries, sponsor prayers for their souls, and leave behind specific instructions like bury me next to my first wife, not my second, because she burned the good linen. And as the decades pass, the Black Death becomes more than a memory. It becomes a cultural scar. A story told in churchyards. A warning etched in marble. A sermon whispered at funerals that quietly reminds everyone, you could be next. So if you're drifting off to sleep right now, and let's be honest, you probably are, imagine this. A candle flickers in a cold medieval chapel. The floor is stone. The air smells like wax and faint rot. Somewhere nearby, a monk chants softly, the Latin syllables bouncing off the damp walls like ghostly Morse code. You're not in a plague pit. You're lucky. You're remembered. And for now, at least, death has taken the night off. You wake up in a dimly lit stone room that smells suspiciously like wet sheep, wood smoke, and existential Catholicism. You stretch, crack your dream neck, and look around. The room isn't yours. For one, the bed is made of straw, the pillow is a sack of stale oats, and someone has definitely been burning frankincense like it's Febreze. A candle flickers beside a wooden box, no lock, just a small brass latch. Curious, you open it. Inside is a finger. Just a finger, perfectly mummified, delicately wrapped in silk, maybe perfumed. Definitely someone importance, judging by the way it's resting on a scrap of embroidered velvet like it's napping before the resurrection. Congratulations. You've just discovered a relic. Not like a cool ancient coin or a Viking comb. No, this is the literal body part of a dead saint, and in the Middle Ages, this was better than gold. You're in the 12th century now. Christianity is booming. Pilgrimage is a thing. The saints are basically celebrities, and people don't just want to hear about them. They want a piece of them. Literally. An elbow. A jawbone. A vial of their congealed blood that mysteriously never dries. If it came from a saint, the medieval church, and every noble with enough coin and political ambition, wanted it. So before we dive into just how far people went to get these relics, and what it says about how medieval folks mourned, coped, and spiritually stockpiled for Judgment Day, take a second. Like the video. Subscribe. I know it's a lot of bone dust and spiritual trauma, but if this kind of relaxing historical madness helps you sleep or makes your existential dread feel a little cozier, then hey, I'm glad you're here. Leave a comment with your time zone and what unholy hour you're listening to this. I read them. I judge none. Okay, let's get back to the finger in the box. So, why did medieval people want chunks of saints? Well, to understand that, you have to understand how they saw death. Unlike our modern funeral, burial, move-on rhythm, medieval people saw death as a journey. Not just for the soul, floating off like a ghostly balloon to heaven or hell, but for the body too. You didn't just decay. You waited. You slept, spiritually, in the earth, preparing for the last judgment, when your body would literally get up again, preferably in one piece. But saints? They were special. They were seen as already holy, already close to God, already radiating divine power. So their bodies didn't have to wait around like yours would. Their bones were sacred. Their hair? Sacred. Their fingernails? Also sacred. In short, their physical remains were spiritually radioactive. And that's where the relic obsession starts. Every monastery, every cathedral, every halfway relevant church wanted to own a relic. Why? Because a relic meant pilgrims, and pilgrims meant money, and money meant power. Imagine a medieval tourism boom, fueled by dismembered saints. People would walk hundreds of miles to kneel in front of a splinter of the true cross, a drop of St. Catherine's breast milk, or St. John the Baptist's finger, of which, suspiciously, 17 were floating around Europe. 17. He had 10, maximum. You do the math. Relics came in 3 classes. First-class relics were actual body parts, bones, hair, blood, teeth. The closer to the brain or heart, the holier. Second-class relics were things a saint had touched, a robe, a sandal, their mug. Third-class relics were objects that had touched a first- or second-class relic, which means by medieval logic, you could take a cloth, rub it on a finger bone, and boom, instant holiness. Like divine transfer by osmosis. Now, the holy bones weren't just kept in dusty boxes. Oh no. These things were displayed, paraded, and encased in gold and glass like the world's holiest action figures. Monasteries would commission elaborate reliquaries, little shrines shaped like arms, legs, miniature churches, or straight-up golden faces, sometimes encrusted with gems, because nothing says divine humility like diamond eyebrows. And this wasn't just religious kitsch. These were serious business. Having a popular relic meant your town got pilgrims. Pilgrims meant trade, inns, food, souvenirs, coins and collection plates, political leverage. Monasteries got rich. Bishops got smug. So what did that lead to? The most chaotic marketplace of body snatching since grave robbing became a career option. Enter the world of holy theft, or, if you want the polite term, translation of relics. Because if a saint didn't want to be stolen, they would have said something, right? St. Nicholas, yes, that Nicholas, the guy who later became Santa Claus, was buried in Myra, in what's now Turkey. But in the 11th century, Italian sailors from Bari showed up, stole his body, and sailed it back home. They built a giant church over his new tomb. Pilgrims came. Bari got rich, and everyone back in Myra was left with a suspiciously empty tomb and a lot of theological side-eye. Even better, when relics got moved, people expected miracles. If your saint was really holy, then when you carried their femur across Europe in a wagon, it would heal the sick along the way. Flowers would bloom. Rain would fall. Bandits would trip over their own swords and cry about their sins. Which, of course, created demand. Every abbey wanted in. And that meant creative relic marketing. Some relics were realish. A bone attributed to St. Peter, passed down with some vague provenance. Others were, well, not so much. A surprising number of churches had the foreskin of Jesus. Yes, that's a sentence I never thought I'd say out loud. At one point, there were at least 14 claimed holy prepuces scattered across Europe, which, again, is more than expected. And how about the milk of the Virgin Mary? Multiple abbeys claimed to have vials of it. At least one monk suggested that white marble dripping with condensation counted as miraculous lactation. You cannot make this up. Well, they could, and they did. Now, you're probably wondering, how did all this tie into mourning? Well, medieval people didn't just mourn their own dead. They mourned holy people. They grieved saints. They saw the keeping and worship of relics as part of how they processed death, not as final, but as ongoing spiritual presence. A finger bone wasn't grotesque. It was comforting. A chipped skull wasn't horror. It was proof that the saint still lived in a mystical, powerful way. And if you were grieving your own loss, a spouse, a child, a friend, praying beside a relic was a way of anchoring that pain in something sacred. something eternal. Plus, there was the very real belief that relics could intercede with God. If you cried beside the femur of a martyr, that martyr might put in a good word for you. And let's be honest, it's easier to grieve when you believe your pain is being noticed by someone who literally got canonized for how much they suffered. But the relic craze got intense. Kings traded relics like luxury items. Emperors gave finger bones as diplomatic gifts. During the Crusades, looting a church's relics was practically expected. In 1204, when the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople, they didn't just take gold. They took hundreds of relics. The head of St. Andrew, the arm of St. James, the aforementioned genuine blood of Christ, all hauled back to Western Europe like divine war trophies. And if you think people treated them reverently after all that, not always. Relics were sometimes fought over by rival monasteries. Stolen again, hidden, broken. Some were boiled to get the bones out of a mummified corpse, which, yes, smells just as bad as you're imagining. Eventually, the church had to step in. In the 13th century, the Fourth Lateran Council said, essentially, guys, please, no more selling relics. No more weird duplication schemes. It's getting out of hand. Did that stop it? Of course not. People just got sneakier. By the 15th century, there were so many bones labeled as St. Barbara's left tibia that it would have taken 4 Barbaras to account for all of them. Still, the emotional function stayed the same. Relics were about connection. They were about memory. They were about hope, not just for miracles now, but for your own death to be something more than just worms and regret. People wanted to believe that a good death meant becoming something sacred. And even if they didn't get sainted, even if their name was never remembered, they could still touch the holy. Pray near it. Ask it to remember them when the trumpets blew on Judgment Day. So next time you see a gilded reliquary in a museum, shaped like a golden hand or a tiny coffin, remember this. It's not just a curiosity. It was once someone's hope, someone's grief, someone's way of mourning without falling apart. And if you're still awake, somehow, congratulations. You've just wandered through the spiritual taxidermy of the Middle Ages. You wake up sweating. Not because of nightmares, though if your dreams featured talking relics or spontaneous martyrdom, that's understandable. No, it's because someone, and by someone, I mean a group of extremely determined relatives, has placed about 12 beeswax candles around your bed. The air is thick, warm, and smells like melting devotion. The linen sheets are damp. Your mouth tastes like iron and dried figs. A priest is standing over you, mumbling Latin, and someone in the corner is holding, yes, that's a chicken. You're not hallucinating. You, my friend, are on your deathbed. And it's going to be a whole production. You see, in the Middle Ages, dying was a group activity. There was no such thing as slipping away quietly under a sterile hospital blanket while Enya played in the background. Oh no. Your death was a public, holy, mildly chaotic event. 1 part funeral pregame, 1 part spiritual exam, and 1 part passive-aggressive family reunion. If this was a play, the curtain would rise on a room full of tension, incense, and someone loudly whispering that you should have confessed your sins last week. The good news? You're not alone. The bad news? You are very much the center of attention, and nobody's pretending otherwise. Your death is officially in the active dying phase, which means the village priest has been called, the neighbors are praying, your children are crying, either from grief or inheritance anxiety, and there's a bowl of holy water by the bed just in case you spontaneously start combusting from unresolved sin. Now let's be clear, death wasn't always this organized. In early medieval periods, think 6th or 7th century, a lot of people died suddenly. Plague, war, infection, horse-related bludgeoning. 1 minute you're eating turnips, the next you've got a spear in your liver. But by the 12th century, as society got a little more stable and literacy rates rose enough for people to start writing detailed wills, the idea of the good death took hold. You were supposed to prepare. Spiritually, emotionally, financially. And that began with a very important checklist. Item 1. Make peace with God. This meant confession, and not just the lazy sorry about everything version you muttered weekly. No, this was the final draft of your sins. The everything you forgot to mention since puberty edit. You summoned a priest and unburdened your soul like your eternal grade depended on it, because it kind of did. If you were lucky, the priest wasn't drunk, asleep, or 70 miles away. He'd listen, nod solemnly, and then give you absolution, basically a divine get-out-of-hell-free card, unless you forgot something important. Like that one time you stole from a monk or failed to pay church tithes during Lent. Oops. Next came communion, your last meal in the most literal sense. The sacrament of the Eucharist was given to you in bed, usually with great ceremony. Bread, wine, and a reminder that you were about to meet the original dinner host, Jesus himself. You were now in a state of grace, stomach mostly empty, soul mostly clean. Cue the candles. Beeswax only. Please, none of that cheap tallow stuff. Why? Because beeswax was considered pure, symbolic of chastity and light. Also, it smelled better. Which was important, because let's be honest, you smelled like a slowly decomposing cheese wheel. The room was hot, smoky, and filled with relatives whispering things like, "Do you think he's actually dying this time?" Yes, he gave away the cow. He never gives away the cow. He also returned Father Bernard's butter churn. Definitely dying. If your family could afford it, someone would be reading the 7 Psalms of Penitence beside your bed. These were the ultimate soundtrack of medieval dying, poetic, mournful, and full of lines like "My bones are vexed and deliver my soul from the sword." Soothing. Sometimes, professional mourners were brought in, women whose entire job was to cry loudly, wail appropriately, and dramatically declare things like, "How can we go on without him," even if they didn't know your last name. They were like the medieval version of Yelp reviews for grief. The louder they cried, the holier your death appeared. And now, about that chicken. No, they weren't here for soup. In some regions, especially rural ones, animals were used in folk rituals to absorb illness or guilt. A chicken or goat might be passed over your body, symbolically taking on your sins, and then released into the wilderness or ritually slaughtered. This is not in the Bible. But people were scared, and they were creative. Superstition filled in the blanks where theology got vague. The important thing is, you're dying properly. Your confession's done. Your family's crying. The local priest has given you last rites, a final anointing with oil on your forehead, chest, hands, and feet. You are, in theory, ready. But here's the twist. Even with all this holy noise, you're not guaranteed to go straight to heaven. Most medieval Christians believed in purgatory, the great celestial waiting room, full of fire and regret. Unless you were a saint, unlikely, or a newborn baby, also unlikely, you'd probably spend a few decades getting spiritually exfoliated before reaching paradise. Which means your death is just the beginning. That's why people tried to stack the odds. If you were rich, or just really, really paranoid, you could hire monks to pray for your soul after you died. Sometimes for a week, sometimes for a year, sometimes until the sun exploded and the last trumpet blew. These monks were basically post-mortem customer service. And this wasn't cheap. People left entire estates to monasteries with strict instructions. Pray for me every Thursday until the apocalypse. Also, don't forget my dog. Wills became elaborate, not just distributing property, but assigning spiritual tasks. Pay the church, feed the poor, light candles, say masses, because the more people you had praying for you, the less time you spent being slowly roasted in purgatory's celestial crockpot. Now, back to your bedroom. Your breathing is slower. People are leaning in. Someone started chanting again, a woe, droning sound like Gregorian snoring. The priest is holding your hand. Your eldest child is quietly panicking about taxes. And then, you exhale. Congratulations. You're dead. But wait, don't relax yet. We're not done. Because now begins the next part, ensuring you stay spiritually intact. The body stays in the room for a while, to be watched, prayed over, and occasionally poked, just in case you were faking it. If you were important enough, a bell was rung to announce your passing. A passing bell, they called it. Sometimes churches rang it as soon as someone was dying, to remind the community to pray. Other times, it was rung after death, as a warning that you had just crossed over and were now haunting the stairwell. This part is crucial. The community must grieve you correctly. Death in the Middle Ages wasn't private. It wasn't hidden. It was public, messy, and deeply ritualized. People didn't turn away from death. They leaned into it. They put your body on display. They held vigils. They sang chants that hadn't changed in 500 years. They processed through town like grief was a parade float. And why? Because it mattered. Not just for you, but for them. Your death reminded them of their own. It reminded them to confess, to give alms, to stop stealing from the granary, to go to Mass. Your death was a lesson. And now, as your body is being washed, wrapped, and prepared for burial, the prayers begin. They pray that your soul doesn't wander, that your sins weren't too many, that your deathbed chicken ritual actually worked. The priest says a few final words. Your name is added to the prayer rolls. Someone scrawls a crude cross in the corner of the death register. And if you're lucky, your body will be buried in consecrated ground, not too close to the lepers, but not so far out that you're sharing real estate with murderers. And that, my sleepy time traveler, is how you die in the Middle Ages. No morphine, no hospital gown, just chickens, wax, regret, and a room full of people hoping your soul finds a shortcut through purgatory. If you're still awake, you deserve some kind of relic for your own spiritual endurance. Maybe a third-class relic touched to a saint's toenail. Maybe just a warm glass of barley water and a nap. Next time, we'll descend into the depths of medieval funeral feasts, corpse cakes, and the strangely festive post-burial parties where people got very drunk in your name. You are dead. Sorry to be blunt, but let's not sugarcoat it, mostly because sugar is a luxury spice imported from somewhere outrageously far away and nobody's wasting it on your corpse. Your body is stiffening, your soul is, hopefully, queuing up for purgatory, and your family is standing around deciding two things. How elaborate your funeral will be. What's for lunch? Because here's the reality of medieval mourning, the food mattered. It's not a party exactly, more of a religiously justified banquet with copious amounts of bread, ale, and passive-aggressive grief. And let's not pretend this was optional. Medieval funerals without food were like weddings without wine. Technically valid, but also deeply suspicious. So, while your body is being prepared for burial, the kitchen fires are already roaring. Let's start with your funeral day itinerary. Yes, you're dead, but that doesn't mean people won't be busy in your name. First comes the funeral procession. Your body, cleaned, dressed, and sometimes perfumed with enough herbs to confuse a monastery's kitchen, is laid in a wooden coffin or, if you're poor, a linen shroud. You are then carried to church. Slowly, with lots of stops for prayers, weeping, and occasional dramatic fainting. Children may follow the body holding candles. Men chant psalms. The local bell tolls. Dogs bark. Somewhere, someone sells commemorative wine flasks. Once in the church, your corpse is placed at the front. You're not allowed to sit in the nave, because, again, you are a corpse, but you still get good real estate, dead center, surrounded by incense and solemn muttering. A mass is performed, complete with chants that sound like they were composed by someone trying to sing while yawning underwater. The priest swings a censer full of burning incense, coating your dead body and the congregation in a thick, aromatic haze that says, "This is about holiness, not the smell of decomposition." By the time the service ends, everyone's starving, which means it's time for the funeral feast. Now, there's no one-size-fits-all version of this. The food, number of guests, and level of enthusiasm depended entirely on your wealth, status, and how tolerable you were in life. But in general, you can expect a lot of bread, shocking. Enormous quantities of ale. Boiled meat that may or may not still be twitching. Dishes seasoned with salt, onion, and existential dread. Let's start with the bread. Not just any bread. Soul bread. Yes, that's a thing. Called panis animarum, in Latin, literally bread of souls. These were loaves baked specifically for the occasion of your death. They were blessed, shared, and eaten by the poor or distributed to guests depending on local tradition. In some parts of Europe, people believed that by eating this bread, they were absorbing a bit of your suffering, helping to lighten your time in purgatory. Like spiritual carb loading. It's weird. It's symbolic. It's glutinous redemption. But wait, it gets better. In some regions, especially in Central Europe and parts of Britain, people bake something far more unsettling, corpse cakes. No, not made from corpses. Although with some of the hygiene standards, who's to say? These were small, round cakes pressed onto your cold, dead chest before being baked and served to mourners. Why? Because that made them sacred. It was believed the cake absorbed some of your spirit. Eating it was like partaking in a medieval emotional support snack, part superstition, part emotional closure, part spiritual cannibalism light. Imagine being handed a muffin and told, "Eat this." It touched Grandpa's armpit. You're welcome. Now, back to the feast. Depending on your status, this event could be a simple post-burial soup in a peasant cottage, or a 3-day extravaganza that made royal weddings look underwhelming. Nobles spared no expense. Whole animals were roasted. Tables groaned under trenchers and pies. Minstrels performed dirges that slowly devolved into bawdy tavern songs once the wine kicked in. And oh, the drinking. Medieval people were already professionally committed to ale. They drank it more often than water, which was usually unsafe. But at funerals, the ale flowed like spiritual lubricant. Toasts were made. Cups were raised to your eternal soul. Someone cried. Someone else tried to seduce your widow. Someone vomited behind the chicken coop. So, you might ask, was all this food and drama just for show? No. It served multiple purposes. Feed the guests, many of whom had traveled far on foot. Honor the dead, by showing off their social ties and generosity. Remind everyone that they too will die someday, so they might want to confess, pay their tithes, and stop stealing from the parish sheik. But perhaps most interesting is the idea of feeding the poor on your behalf. This wasn't just charity. It was strategic. In many communities, part of your funeral feast was reserved for the beggars and the marginalized because their prayers were seen as particularly effective. Why? Because they suffered more. Their suffering gave them spiritual clout. A rich noble might pay for 20 poor people to eat bread and stew in his name, hoping their gratitude would turn into prayers, and prayers would shorten his stay in purgatory. It's like hiring a group of spiritually powerful Yelp reviewers to give you 5 stars in the afterlife. There were also funeral tokens. Sometimes, guests received small items, candles, rings, even coins stamped with your family crest. In some cases, these were reminders to pray for your soul. In others, they were just subtle ways to show off. Look what I got at Lord Farnsworth's death feast. Real wax. Fancy Latin inscription. Still smells like incense and despair. And of course, every feast needed entertainment. Yes, it sounds jarring, but it wasn't unusual for music to follow mourning. People didn't see joy and grief as incompatible. After the somber rites, it was common to transition into celebration. Life was short. Death was always nearby. But food was warm, ale was strong, and someone was always willing to sing about lost love, dead saints, or tragic goats. Now let's take a quick sensory tour of your own hypothetical feast. You're not there, obviously, but imagine it from the perspective of your cousin Henry, who's already had 3 mugs of ale and 2 meat pies. The hall is dim, lit by tallow candles and a few shafts of late afternoon light. The air smells of roasted mutton, cloves, damp wool, and something faintly sweet. Maybe that soul bread your widow had specially blessed by Father Godric. There's a bard in the corner, humming a dirge on a lute with 2 broken strings. At the long oak table, your relatives argue gently about who gets the plow, who was always your favorite, and whether your sudden fever was caused by a bad fish or divine punishment. Children run between benches, stealing bread. Someone drops a spoon in your memory. Someone else raises a toast to Edmund. May he rest in peace, and may he never come back to haunt the grain cellar. Everyone laughs, except your widow. She's still crying, probably about the debt. And thus, the feast continues. As night falls, people stumble home, full of food, drink, stories, and prayers. Some carry leftovers. Others carry gossip. A few might stop by your grave on the way out, just to say a quick word, light a candle, or nervously ask you to keep the rain away this season. It's not elegant. It's not quiet. But it's honest. And in the chaotic world of medieval life, that might just be the most human way to say goodbye. Next time, we'll descend even deeper into the land of the dead, into burial rites, grave digging, what your tomb said about your sins, and the awkward reality of being exhumed 200 years later because someone else wanted your plot. You are now officially underground. Congratulations. You've made it to the final chapter of life, the dirt nap, the eternal snooze button, the part of the story where the main character is horizontal and profoundly unavailable. You are dead, wrapped in linen, packed in a wooden coffin, if you could afford it, and lowered into a hole. You would think the hard part is over. But no. The medieval afterlife is not exactly a peaceful journey. It's full of drama, superstition, and the occasional exhumation due to poor long-term planning. We're going to walk you through what happens after the funeral feast, when your mourners have wandered home drunk and full of boiled meats, and the grave diggers, probably named something like Wilfred or Thaddeus the Left-Handed, start shoveling. First of all, let's address the idea that medieval graves were deep. They weren't. Not by modern standards. The phrase 6 feet under is a bit misleading in medieval contexts. Most graves hovered closer to 4 feet deep, sometimes less if the ground was stubborn or the gravediggers were just kind of over it. So technically, your neighbors could trip over your grave and kick you in the face if the soil eroded too much. And coffins? Optional. If you were poor, and statistically, you were, then your body was wrapped in a shroud made of plain linen. It might have been tied at the head and feet like a tragic meatball sub. You'd be lowered into the dirt, sometimes with a wooden board beneath you, sometimes not. The goal wasn't comfort. The goal was decomposition with dignity. So, let's say you're lying there, in your plot. You've got your arms crossed. Your eyes are shut, hopefully. Your soul is drifting somewhere between the gates of purgatory and a medieval understanding of cosmic customer service. Above you, the priest is saying a few final prayers, some in Latin, some in the local dialect, and all at a volume that suggests he'd rather be inside having soup. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, amen. Then, dirt. Lots of dirt. Shovels clink. Earth falls. Someone sneezes. A chicken wanders too close and is shooed away. And just like that, you are interred. But don't get too comfortable. Because depending on how rich, pious, or inconvenient you were in life, this burial might not be your last. Let's talk grave reuse. Medieval cemeteries were crowded, especially in cities. And while every soul was supposed to have a resting place, real estate was tight. Very tight. Like sharing your eternal bed with the guy who sold fish guts at market tight. Churchyards were the go-to location for burials, especially because of the belief that the closer you were buried to the church, the better your afterlife perks. Being buried inside the church? That was the medieval VIP lounge, reserved for saints, bishops, rich patrons, and the occasional local hero who didn't commit too many sins in public. Buried outside the church walls, in the surrounding yard? Acceptable. Buried outside the walls of the cemetery entirely? That was for heretics, criminals, and people the church really did not want Jesus to notice. But because churchyard space was limited and decomposition was slow, especially in cooler climates, graves were often reused. Not after a few centuries. No, sometimes after just a few years. The average decomposition cycle wasn't respected. It was more of a loose guideline. So if your bones hadn't fully disintegrated by the time someone new needed your plot, tough luck. You'd be exhumed, your skull tossed into a charnel house, and the space repurposed for someone newer, fresher, and possibly richer. This wasn't seen as disrespectful. It was just logistical. Bones were often stacked in ossuaries, special vaults or buildings where old remains were stored. You might be familiar with the Paris catacombs, which contained the bones of 6 million people. Medieval Europe did this too, just less dramatically and with more mildew. So the next time you feel bad about modern housing shortages, remember your medieval ancestors had grave shortages. Now let's pivot to grave markers. You want to be remembered, right? Of course you do. Everyone does. But unless you were rich, powerful, or notably difficult to ignore, your grave marker was going to be simple at best. Wooden crosses were common but temporary. They'd rot, fall over, or be used as firewood by someone with a loose moral code and cold toes. Stone markers were reserved for the wealthy. And even then, the inscriptions were often brief and slightly judgmental. Here lies Edwin, who feared God and paid his debts. Pray for Margaret, lest she linger in purgatory longer than her roast ever did in the oven. Roger. That's it. Just Roger. Inside churches, important burials were marked by tombs or effigies, stone carvings of the deceased lying in perpetual prayer, often with tiny dogs or lions at their feet to symbolize loyalty, courage, or really liked animals. But don't let the statues fool you. The bodies beneath them were not always intact. Tombs were reused. Bodies were moved. Sometimes, people paid to be buried next to saints, only to find out later that the saints' bones had also been relocated, possibly to another country. Even in death, you could get evicted. Now, let's talk about what was buried with you. If you were Anglo-Saxon or Norse in early medieval times, grave goods were the norm. Weapons, jewelry, pots, food, even pets. Vikings famously buried their dead with boats because subtlety was not their strong suit. But as Christianity took over, grave goods fell out of favor. The church frowned on people dragging material wealth into the afterlife. The only thing you were supposed to bring was prayers, and maybe a few coins to pay the gravediggers. That said, exceptions existed. Pilgrims were often buried with badges, little pewter tokens from their travels. Crusaders were sometimes buried with crosses, swords, or little sachets of dirt from Jerusalem. And high-status individuals might be buried in stone coffins, sometimes lined with lead, which is great for preserving corpses and terrible for literally everything else, including the groundwater. Then there's the matter of plague burials. Oh yes, during major outbreaks, especially the Black Death, traditional burials went out the window. No prayers, no funeral feasts. Just mass graves, lime pits, and a terrifying efficiency born out of desperation. Bodies were dumped in layers, wrapped, unwrapped, half-rotting. The living didn't have time for rituals. The priests couldn't keep up. The bell tolled until it broke. In these cases, your resting place was more trench than tomb. Your marker was a memory, if that. Let's now explore one of the strangest posthumous customs, disinterment for reputation reasons. Occasionally, a corpse would be dug up because the church had changed its mind about you. Sometimes, people were excommunicated after death, which meant their remains had to be removed from consecrated ground. Your skeleton could be flung from a church, burned in public, or buried upside down in shame. In one particularly dramatic case, the Catholic Church exhumed a pope, Pope Formosus, and put his corpse on trial. Yes, a literal cadaver synod. His decaying body was propped up on a throne, dressed in papal robes, and questioned in Latin. Spoiler, he lost the case. His corpse was stripped, thrown in the Tiber River, and then later fished out and buried again. Medieval justice had range. And finally, we have to talk about posthumous miracles. Sometimes, a grave became famous. If someone was believed to be especially holy, a saint, a martyr, or just unusually fragrant after death, their grave might become a pilgrimage site. People would leave offerings, kneel in prayer, or try to chip off a piece of your tombstone for spiritual luck. It was like Etsy meets relic worship. In rare cases, your body might be exhumed and displayed, especially if it hadn't decayed. This was seen as a sign of sainthood. Being overly decomposed, however, was not held against you, unless you smelled so bad your local monastery fled the region. So, to wrap it all up, being buried in the Middle Ages was more than just dying and disappearing. It was a process, a performance, a logistical dance between piety, politics, space constraints, and the weather. You might stay in your grave for eternity, or for 6 months until the abbot's nephew needed the spot. You might be remembered with a carved stone, or forgotten entirely when your wooden cross collapsed during a storm. But no matter what, your death was part of a living tradition. A messy, reverent, grimly beautiful choreography between the living and the dead. And honestly, in a time when life was short, brutal, and full of mud, that's kinda poetic. Now, take a breath. Roll over in your imaginary grave. And get ready for Chapter 11, where we'll explore the dark and occasionally smelly world of relics, saint bones, and why people wanted to keep your femur on the mantelpiece.